In this video, we'll take a deep dive into how the team works together on a day-to-day basis. We'll introduce how doing things the agile way helps to achieve the goal of releasing the first version of your product in 8 weeks. Let's first do a quick recap of the 2 project phases we described in the idea to reality video. It is during the exploratory phase that we determine the scope of the project and decide on which features should go into the first release of the product. The product comes to life during the construction phase. The programmers work with the rest of the team and work through the feature list as detailed in the release plan. Of course, if only life were that easy. The real magic lies in how the team adapts to uncertainty and inevitable change during these 2 phases. Let's start with the exploratory phase. There are 2 parts in this phase, elaboration and estimation. The goal during elaboration is to understand both the product and the surrounding business model very well. Key components of the business model include figuring out the targeted customer segment, who's the competition if any, and the planned revenue streams for the product, among other things. A good amount of time is also invested in breaking down the product idea into MMFs or minimum marketable features and their corresponding stories. An MMF is very simply the smallest unit of functionality which is marketable to the end user. MMFs typically take about a week to build, so we break them down further into stories. Each story usually takes about 1 to 2 days to build. This allows us to demonstrate progress and get feedback more frequently. Wireframes are also created during this time to help visualize and detail how the end user will interact with the product. Toward the end of the stage, the architect usually has enough to work on and start recommending the main technological choices for the product. All of these tasks require close collaboration between the customer, the BA, the product manager, and the architect. The second part of the exploratory phase is where we get to the estimation and planning bit. The goal of this phase is to come up with what's called a release plan, which will specify which features will be included for release 1 and the target release date. The process to create the release plan is straightforward. It starts with estimating each of the stories and features that have already been identified. Once the estimates are ready, each feature is prioritized, keeping in mind 2 things: the value it adds to the product relative to other features and its estimate. Once the prioritization of all features is completed, the features are bucketed into 1 or more releases. This is done using a time boxing technique. Since we only have 6 weeks of construction to get to release 1 and we already have a prioritized list of features at this point, we simply absorb as many of the higher priority features that will fit in the 6 weeks time frame. The date of the release is calculated by simply adding 8 weeks to the date on which the exploratory phase started. And here's the team that's involved in this whole exercise. That is everyone who was already there earlier, but this time we also have programmers. It is only appropriate to have the programmers estimate the stories because it is they who will finally be converting the requirements into code. At the end of the exploratory phase, you, the customer, can take a few days to review everything if you prefer. Assuming you find everything okay, we would start the construction phase shortly behind the exploratory phase. The goal of the construction phase is simple, that is, to get the release 1 of a product out the door in 6 weeks. Before diving into the details, let's take a look at the team for this phase. All roles that were introduced during the exploratory phase continue into the construction phase as well. In addition, we also introduce the only missing role at this point, and that is the project manager. And that's pretty much the whole team for the construction phase. There's a bunch of things to set up before the team can start churning out working software. This setup takes about 3 to 5 days depending on the complexity of the project. Broadly, the setup activities are really of 3 types. Infrastructure setup for the programmers, referred to as development in the slide, the project management infrastructure, and thirdly, requirements and UI design related work. This third item is not really setup work, but we'll come back to this shortly. All of these can happen in parallel because each of them is handled by different roles, as you can see here. The programmers take care of most of what they need to do on their own. Sometimes they also rely on the architect to help them out. The project manager works alone at this stage, working through a list of predefined checklists as we'll see shortly. As expected, the BA and the designer are responsible for the requirements and UI design bit. Let's take a look at some of the tasks that the programmers work on during kickoff. Dev machine configuration refers to installing any additional software that may be required for this project. Continuous deployment setup refers to creating what is called a build pipeline for moving working software from development to staging and then to production. Please make sure to watch the continuous delivery video to learn more about this. Moving on. Technical kickstart checklists include things like configuring tools and services that we would need for development. These include exception notifier systems, code analyzer tools, setting up and configuring the automated test infrastructure, etc. Finally, architectural spikes are required to test any technological assumptions that might have been made by the architect in the recommendations. These could either be technological components that are new in the world in general, or they could be items that the team does not have enough experience on already. Either way, spikes, as they are called, allow the team to test these assumptions by conducting small experiments. If any surprises are discovered, the architect modifies the recommendations to mitigate the risk. Let's move on to the project management kickoff items. There's a host of online project management tools out there. We've done the research to find the ones which allow us to track project progress and help us collaborate better while also staying out of the way when we don't need them. Make sure to watch the collaboration tools video to learn more about the tools that we prefer. While the programmers focus on their technical checklists, the project manager has her own set of things to take care of. These include, for example, walking a new customer through the project management tools and processes that we use and creating what we call a done checklist. This checklist is a customized laundry list of checks to run on every story that we ship. While the programmers and the project manager are busy getting ready to kick off the project, the BA and the designer work with the customer on detailing the requirements, setting the UI theme for the product, and finally creating the UI designs for the first couple of stories. This allows them to gain some lead time ahead of the programmers, which they could maintain throughout the project in the weeks afterward. This is explained in more detail in the next few slides. Let's now dive into the heart of how the team actually works together to ship working software on a frequent basis. Let's say you came to us asking us to build a swing for you, or a software simulation of a swing, if you will. If you were to follow what's called a waterfall model, we would do it this way. Each member on the team would do their bit and then hand off the work once they were done with all of it to the next person in the sequence. And once the last person in the sequence is done with their work, there's one release at the end. While this process makes logical sense, following that route usually ends up in a scenario such as this. While this image is quite funny, the unfortunate truth is that more than 80% of software projects tend to end up in similar situations. Writing specifications with high accuracy for the whole product in the beginning of the project is quite ineffective. If that specification is used as the sole input from the customer, what ends up happening is not very different from what you see in this image. There are two main problems with the waterfall approach. The original product idea tends to get lost in translation because the direction of the information flow is restricted to flowing only downstream for the most part. This lack of interaction and feedback between the various roles on the team results in the wrong product getting built. And secondly, there's also very little room for adapting to changing scenarios in the marketplace. Almost any significant change that is requested for midway through the construction process results in creating a lot of rework for the team, thereby increasing cost and disrupting the schedule of the project. So how do we solve these problems? The answer is simple: by releasing working software many times throughout the construction phase. Working software begs for feedback by its very existence. It's much easier to detect communication gaps when you can play around with working software, because what gets built and shipped is based on what was perceived by various members on the team, which could be quite different from what was conveyed to them. As you can see on the left, the risk of failure by building the wrong product rises as time passes. With the agile approach, however, this is constantly mitigated over time. So that's the theory. But how does it work in practice? Is the solution to avoid any kind of structure altogether and just do whatever makes sense at the moment? Let's look at some specific questions. How does the team manage to ship software as frequent as every 2 days or less? What about the time required to test and deploy changes? There's also the question of how frequently the requirements can be changed in the scenario. Can we allow for changes every day? And then there's the question of how this impacts communication within the team. Achieving the above two things will obviously require a high level of communication between various roles in the team, and that could result in a bad signal to noise ratio as well. You're probably at least a little curious at this point. We'll answer all those questions in the next couple of minutes by taking a much closer look at how we manage everything on a daily basis. To start with, the BA is in constant touch with the customer throughout the construction phase. While the UX designer's interaction is also pretty high with the customer, it starts tapering off about midway through this phase. The expectation is that by around that time, the designs are ready for most screens required for release 1. Together, this team creates wireframes and UI designs for those features and stories that were finalized during the exploratory phase for release 1. And this is done at a fairly rapid pace to allow for discovering things that might have been previously overlooked. As and when new things get discovered, this team creates new stories and maybe even new features as required. Then the team works together with the programmers to estimate the new items and then together determines the priority of the newly added items. If they are considered higher priority than the ones in the existing backlog, then the new items are swapped in to replace other items of similar size but of lower priority. But that leaves out one item, the user acceptance criteria. These are very low-level details specified for each story by the BA. These include alternate scenarios, test cases, validations, and business rules for the corresponding story. Documenting the UACs is time-consuming work and is best done only for those stories which are at the top of the backlog and likely to be picked up by the programmers within the next week. This reduces the possibility of wasted effort on the part of the BA and also allows for flexibility in terms of making changes to those features and stories further down the backlog. As you can probably imagine by now, all of the deliverables from the BA and the designer flow to the programmer pair on a continuous basis. Usually, these requirements are hot from the oven, so to speak, and hence are not stale. That in turn reduces the need for programmers to rework these stories as well later in the project. Finally, it's also possible that once the programmers start coding a story, they will uncover certain things that were overlooked by the BA and the designer. We leave enough slack within the plan to absorb these kinds of surprises as well. Of course, keeping the line of communication multi-directional helps a lot as well. Every story is intentionally kept small enough to allow programmers to finish coding them in 2 days or less. Further, the programmer pair works only on one story at a time at most times, except in exceptional cases such as when we have a bug reported in the system. All of this allows the programmer to ship stories at least once every 2 days. As already mentioned, they write automated tests for all of the business logic in the code. And they run these tests multiple times a day to ensure that whatever was already working is still working, as they're adding new code or changing or deleting existing code. Once a story has been coded, the code is pushed through our completely automated continuous deployment pipeline to finally end up in the staging environment. At this stage, the story is ready for the customer to try out, either on the web or on their mobile device, as the case may be. You will notice that we don't have a separate testing step after the programmers are done. This is quite intentional and a reflection of the confidence on the part of the team about the quality of their work. As mentioned earlier, the automated tests typically only cover about 80% of the scenarios. The rest is handled by the exploratory tester in the staging environment. What that means is that we have both the customer and the tester looking at the newly shipped story at the same time. The two of them look at the story from a different perspective, so this helps the team get much needed feedback from both sources simultaneously. We'll now introduce some terminology to make it easier to refer to all of these activities. What the BA and the UI designer do to keep ahead of the programmers by a week, but no more, is called progressive elaboration. The programmers leverage automation at the testing and deployment stages to implement the concept of continuous deployment. And finally, the tester does what is called exploratory testing, which is different from checking, in that testing is a not urgent but important creative activity to uncover new scenarios while touring a working product. Checking, on the other hand, is a mundane exercise to ensure that what was working is still working, which of course is already taken care of by the automated test code written by the programmers. This is a good time for us to zoom out and take a look at the major concepts that we have now implemented with the practices that were described in this video. You will remember seeing this picture from the big picture video, the first one in the series. The exploratory phase, continuous deployment, and test-driven development are all practices that help in deliberate discovery. The cohesive team structure, along with the multi-channel communication, high levels of automation in testing and deployment, the involvement of the product manager, and progressive elaboration are practices that help to implement interdependence, lean thinking, systems thinking, and theory of constraints, respectively. Thanks for watching. At this point, you should have a good idea of how we do things at Multunus. Watch the rest of the series to learn more about the tools that we use and to understand more about the concepts such as technical debt and continuous deployment.